When New Zealand was the first country to introduce...
Sorry. No, sorry about that. We haven't actually gone live, and we're live now, but I'll introduce the debate first. Cool. Okay, welcome everybody to round 2 of International 2020. On the affirmative, we have Northland, and on the negative, we have Auckland Blue. Without further ado, I'd like to invite up the first speaker of the affirmative team.
I think we're having, sorry to stop everyone again, having a few connection issues again. So can everyone stop your video unless you're speaking, just to try and deal with that.
So can I start now?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. New Zealand was the first country to introduce women's rights to vote. One of the first countries with Indigenous councillors to promote more Indigenous inclusion within culture. Why are we known for a sport where buff guys go on the field and tackle each other for a ball? We think this is a negative, this is not an effective use and not a good thing to tie New Zealand's national identity to. Today, we'll be proving to you why tying sports to our sports prominence to our national identity is detrimental to social progress and the progress of New Zealand culture. Today, as the affirming team, we support a healthy, progressive environment, an environment which includes different cultures and includes traditions accurately, and we don't support the image of New Zealand promoting toxic masculinity, traditionalism, or being based on entertainment. Our alternative is that instead of the prominence of sports for the New Zealand national identity, we think it would have been better had we emphasised cultural or our social development. The points we'll be bringing to you today is firstly, how sports as a national identity inhibits social progress. Secondly, how it promotes of divisive and isolating behaviour. And thirdly, how sports holds a colonial legacy. So on to my first point about how sports as a national identity inhibits social progress. What we see happening right now is that New Zealand has one of the highest rates of suicide, with the leading category of people being Māori males under the age of 40. With New Zealand's system set up to have free healthcare and access to counsellors, we recognise the problem stems from the New Zealand culture and the emphasis on gender roles. We recognise that in New Zealand culture, we recognise that in New Zealand culture, people have become so invested in rugby that we've seen the supporters shouting slurs at other teams just because they have this incessant need to win. What we see has happened due to the prominence of sports in New Zealand identity is that it has entrenched traditional gender roles. When people think of New Zealand, yes?
The Silver Ferns is one of the most prominent sports teams in New Zealand. Isn't this how sports is promoting gender equality within New Zealand society?
I'm just about to do that, and how it's entrenched traditional gender roles, right? So when you think of New Zealand, you think of those sports, the two sports you think of is rugby and netball. Netball is the females' game and the uniform is literally they have to wear skirts and dresses. In rugby, you have to have the build, you have to be big and buff, you have to have a lot of muscle, and it's men tackling each other over a ball, they can't show weakness. And we see that for example, in netball, you don't see many male teams, and you really don't hear about males within netball, which is considered more of a feminine sport. And in rugby, even though we have very good women's teams, you also don't hear about them as much in New Zealand media or in overseas media, and we think that this has been a really negative emphasis on this harmful toxic masculinity mindset, and we think that this has set the tone in New Zealand that men are associated with rugby and they have to be tough, they can't be soft because that's just a weakness, and we think that that has been really detrimental to the development of young males within society, when they're only the only role models they have have to like really look up to and to attach their national identity to are like people who can't show weakness, people who can't like show their emotions and things like that. And we think that that is like really supported by the facts that I gave earlier about how the leading category of people with high rates of suicide is like Māori males under the age of 40, which means we have a massive cultural like identity issue and an issue with like masculinity. And then secondly, how it entrenches traditionalism within the culture. We see that people like because of the highly competitive nature of the sport, people won't concede on sports to the extent where when the Springboks toured New Zealand, people refused to boycott the Springboks, even though there was the apartheid in Africa going on at the time, because they wanted to see a rugby game and they wanted to see like a competition. When they're valuing the competition over like the progress of massive social movements, we see that this is extremely detrimental, and we see that this is like a really negative mindset for like the New Zealand's national identities who have been attached to like rugby. And we see that like thirdly with like women's representation, we see that like even though we have a women's rugby team, it's much less known than the men's one team. Like everyone knows the All Blacks, but probably like over half New Zealand probably couldn't even name the women's team, even though they are massive and they have won their division 2 years in a row. They still don't get like the recognition that they deserve. And we think that this is how it negatively impacts like women's representation. And so what do we see as like outcomes of this? We see that like because we see that firstly, like young people don't have good role models to look up to because they only have like these like stereotyped figures of like rugby players and like netball players. And secondly, we see that that women feel like they are undervalued within society because even though they're achieving at the same rate, they're not being recognised for their achievements as well. So onto my second point about why the prominence of sports promotes a divisive and isolating behaviour. As I said earlier, what we saw was when the Springboks came to New Zealand is like when the All Blacks broke their winning streak, the nation, like New Zealand bandwagon hated on the coach for not doing a good enough job because they were so competitive and they were so upset about losing that the entire team hated on one person and put all this pressure on one person just because they lost to another country. Secondly, like with New Zealand's massive binge drinking culture, we also think that this is like a really negative thing to like associate like our national identity to, and how this heightens like the conflict relationship between like different rival sports teams and sports teams from other nations. So what we see has happened due to like our sports being like the prominence of our national identity. Yes.
Would you support removing the platform that the All Blacks have to talk about mental health and their experiences with anxiety and depression?
I think that we should I think that while we should still have a platform for All Blacks because it is entertainment, I think that we should really emphasise like mental health and well-being, considering it's one of the biggest issues in New Zealand right now and one that we lose a lot of lives to. So firstly, what has happened because of the prominence of sports is that firstly we have promoted this massive culture based on conflict, where people from like regional teams that are different, go from different areas, they've actually it's a really unhealthy competition because they're often in environments that are surrounded by alcohol, fueling like their emotions are heightened, and now they're hating on each other and getting violent towards each other. I think this is a really negative relationship. Secondly, the heightened nationalism. We see that this has increased because of the lack of progression and the underrepresentation of this. We think
Yep, I've paused the timer. It's just over 8 minutes 15 at the moment. Are the speakers still there?
Yeah.
Did you finish your speech? It sounded like you cut off right at the end.
Oh yes, sorry. I realized that I was going over time, so I just quickly did my conclusion.
Ah, cool, sweet. I thank the speaker for their speech, and I'd like to invite up the first speaker of the negative team.
Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
As a refugee coming to New Zealand, you don't have much which you can feel like you belong with. You don't have much where you can feel a sense of collective pride. You come from a completely different culture, a complete different set of socioeconomic positions. But on our side of the house, we give that individual the ability to collectively organise behind the All Blacks, behind the Silver Ferns, to feel that national pride when you're amid a crowd of 40,000 at Eden Park or the Basin Reserve. That's something that you don't get underside affirmatives world. What do we support in today's debate? We support sport being a prominent aspect of New Zealand's national identity. Importantly, note that this includes many sports and a diverse range of both male and female sports. So we don't accept side affirmatives characterisation that just means the All Blacks. What does this look like? Three things. Firstly, at the community level, it looks like netball, soccer, cricket and rugby clubs being important pillars of New Zealand society, places where people play and support people from the sideline. Secondly, at the national level, it looks like New Zealanders collectively organising behind the All Blacks, behind the Black Ferns, behind the White Ferns. Thirdly, on the day-to-day level, it looks like a common topic of discussion being local or national sport around the workplace when you see your friends. We're going to win today's debate by proving that sport as a national identity is uniquely able to offer an accessible and inclusive focal point that instills positive values in New Zealanders. Three substantives for the House. Firstly, how having sport as a prominent part of our identity positively shapes and unites New Zealand society. Secondly, how this national identity promotes constructive individual behaviour and values. And Kunli'll split, telling you why it is beneficial that sport cannot be politicized. But before that, let's take a look at side affirmatives case. Three things here. Firstly, their counter model was that we support cultural diversity and social progress being having a prominent place as part of New Zealand's national identity. Two responses to this. Firstly, we think that this is just not something that New Zealanders can collectively rally behind to the same extent, because recognising cultural diversity is great and we still support that on our side of the house, but it's not something that you can instill the same type of national pride, because it necessarily involves recognising fundamental differences between New Zealanders. We don't think it offers the same amount of national pride that you get when you support someone at a netball game. Secondly, we tell you that this idea of cultural diversity and social progress is divisive in nature, and not all New Zealanders support this diversity or are advocates for all of the social progress that we've achieved. Crucially, we think that a national identity should include everyone and be something that is accessible. Sport does this. Having cultural diversity is important, but it's not something we should pin our national identity on. Their second claim was that sport promotes negative stereotypes around masculinity and women and traditionalism. Two responses to this. Firstly, we just refute that sport is like completely male dominated and gives really bad representations of women in New Zealand. We think that a lot of young women have female sporting heroes like Lisa Carrington, like Valerie Adams, and they're put on just the same pedestal that we have in New Zealand society as men. But even if there's slightly less, let's look at the comparative, because they don't get any pedestal on their side of the house. You don't get to change any stereotypes regarding women, regarding minorities. Second response is that we just disagree that the All Blacks exhibit all of this toxic masculinity. Even if we accept that our sporting identity is based solely on the All Blacks, we think that with the introduction of things like mental health, when key players like Kieran Reid talk about how hard it is to be an All Black, to be in that position, this is really important. Importantly, sports heroes respond to public demand. So we think when there's a large-scale demand for being more acceptive and talking about progressive issues, we think that our sporting identity will embody that. That's why we've seen that wholesale change. Okay, let's now take a look at our case on why, firstly, on how having sport as a prominent part of our national identity positively shapes and unites New Zealand society. 4 things here. Firstly, we tell you that sport is something accessible that anyone can engage with, because you can engage in 2 ways. You can either be engaging as a player or a supporter. We think as a player, it's easy to engage as most sport is financially accessible or subsidised, and as there is such a wide range of sports available for both boys and girls. But secondly, we tell you as a spectator, there are also relatively low barriers to entry because it just requires you to watch a bit of cricket or to check the netball result online, something that most New Zealanders engage with. Crucially, sport is something that people can directly connect themselves with, regardless of their socioeconomic position, ethnicity, gender, or politics. Second thing, sport gives New Zealanders common ground with each other. Because when all New Zealanders are supporting the same team and playing similar codes, you feel a sense of belonging within New Zealand society and feel connected to fellow New Zealanders. I addressed this in my introduction. This is something that we get exclusively on our side of the house when you can unify behind sport. Thirdly, we tell you that sport instills national pride, because it's important to recognise here that New Zealand is very good at sport. We've won multiple Rugby World Cups, Cricket World Cups, gold medals per capita, Netball World Cups. We think when we're so successful, we should use that as a platform for our national pride, because when New Zealand teams do well abroad, that makes people proud to be a New Zealander, and they also feel like they've got a stake in it, because they feel like that support we gave you on the weekend was the difference that got the team over the line. This is so important because it promotes social cohesion and just people having like faith in the government and in New Zealand society. I'll take a POI.
When New Zealand is world leading in important issues such as women equality and rights, why is it then so much more important that we are known for a sport where men tackle each other over a ball?
Look, I've addressed that we think our national identity based on sport is far broader than that. I think we can still champion social issues, but as I'm detailing out here, there are many reasons why sport exclusively gives benefits to New Zealanders and New Zealand society. Finally, on this point, we tell you that sport provides a pathway for progress on social issues, because historically, as side affirmative have addressed, New Zealand, like most countries, has had issues with racism and sexism. But when people from these marginalised groups do well in sport, you get rid of stereotypes and negative perceptions of minority groups. This looks like what's happened with Jonah Lomu doing so well. It looks like Lisa Carrington and Valerie Adams being key female athletes. It looks like people like Ajaz Patel and Ish Sodhi defunking stereotypes regarding Indian people in New Zealand. Crucially, all people from minority groups can excel, and we change the perception regarding these people when we have sport as part of our national identity. Finally, then, let's look at how this national identity promotes constructive individual behaviour. Because we tell you that sport endorses acting in line with positive values. Like when you play a game of rugby or netball or cricket, you're taught values of resilience when you're down by 40, or self-sacrifice when you put your body and comfort on the line for your teammates. These values are instilled in New Zealanders in 2 ways. Firstly, just through playing the sport, individuals adopt them. But secondly, because New Zealanders respect their sporting heroes so much, they aim to embody these values in their everyday life. This looks like Kiwi children attempting to replicate the humility that Kane Williamson showed after the 2019 Rugby World Cup, Cricket World Cup final, or the grit that the Silver Ferns showed to come back from their devastating 2018 Commonwealth Games performance and win the Netball World Cup in 2019. We teach these positive values through putting sport on this platform in New Zealand society. We make individual lives richer, but we get people to contribute more to New Zealand society. So proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for their speech and would like to invite up the second speaker of the affirmative team.
When the opposition came up here today and told us that social progress is divisive in nature and that making and celebrating women giving the right to vote in New Zealand for the first time will be too divisive to be able to unite New Zealand, we think something went wrong with our culture and our national identity to allow such a large amount of people to actively oppose these modes of social progress. And we want to look at the losses that were provoked by prioritizing sport first and foremost and attaching it to our national identity. Main points of clash for you today. Firstly, we have this concept of who best gets social progress on either side of the house, who best improves cultural values and norms as a result of their sides of the house, and then also this further point on is sport divisive in nature, followed by my split point on how New Zealand sports holds a colonial legacy. On this first point of clash on social progress, we think as a retroactive motion looking back at the past and seeing if we regret something, we have to clearly analyse the losses New Zealand may have suffered as a result of elevating sport and prominence instead of other things. Because when this side came up and told us today that things like women giving the right to vote and celebrating that is too divisive, we think that may have been a result of throughout our entire national history, prioritizing things like sport instead of celebrating things like movements for social progress. We think the very fact that social progress can be alienating to some is a direct result of their side of the house, you know, entrenching the sense of traditionalism and toxic masculinity that we're giving a minimized analysis as to why it came about at first. Yes, I'll take your point of information.
What do you think makes a refugee feel more like a New Zealander? Being told that New Zealand was the first country that gave the right to vote over 100 years ago to women, or being able to go to a pub or a cricket ground and watch the All Blacks or Black Caps play?
Well, because 50% of these refugees are probably women, I think they would appreciate the literal right to vote more over being able to go to a pub, you know? Being able to actually participate in the government and the democracy is probably slightly more important than going and watching TV in a pub. We think that's a completely ridiculous point of information and pretty much proves our point. Also, we saw more of this ignorance from their side of the house when they told us that women are placed on just the same pedestal as men, right? Because in reality, we see that the funding, the actual money, the millions of dollars going into these sports teams is far more funneled towards male-driven sports, male teams, rather than female teams, right? Because in a point of information in our first speech, we were told that, you know, the Silver Ferns are like one of New Zealand's most famous teams. But if you actually go internationally and ask people, it will be overwhelmingly the All Blacks. Why is this? Because there is such a drive within sports to be competitive, to become on top, and because it's not about participation, but it's about prioritizing success, win or die imperative, it means that people who are just trying to participate in sports, who are trying to do their best, are not celebrated to the extent as if they were a man who's, you know, coming first in the world in a men's competition. We think that by saying women are placed on just the same pedestal, they're minimizing and erasing all the actual struggles women have to get equal pay in these sectors of the economy. They also brought us this kind of ridiculous idea that sport is somehow this overarching thing to unite New Zealand. But when they did this, they completely ignored the very deep divisive nature of sport, right? Because we've seen sports games, sports competitions contributing deeply to tribalism and nationalism. In conflict-based games like sports, there's a win-lose relationship that is constantly enforced. You may feel like solidarity is standing with somebody who's like on your same team as you, supporting the same team as you, but at the same time, you're jeering at the people across the stadium who are from a different region, who are from a different country, who you want to lose, who you have a very deep vested interest in seeing them fail and seeing them subjugated and lose to your side, your team. We see that when New Zealand so deeply ties sports teams to regions, we see this competing regionalism, this producing tribalism between different areas. And this is exacerbated at a worldwide level, right? Because we see that sports competitions foster a sense of national superiority. There's a massive desire to see other countries lose and be subjugated by New Zealand's team, to the point where people will eat their own, criticize and harass their own team for simply failing to destroy and beat another team. This is a massively toxic environment that doesn't unite New Zealand, but actually splinters and fragments New Zealand into competing sections who are constantly arguing with each other and opposing each other. If you go to any local sports game and you see people traveling in from other regions to support their team, you can see people yelling at each other across the stadium, jeering at each other, making comments to each other when one team beats another. We do not stand for this whatsoever on our side of the house. They also taught us that sports brings us all these lovely values, right? Like the sportsmanship, the resilience, all that kind of stuff. But we see in practice, this exists only minimally due to the conflict-driven competitive nature of sport, because there is this win-lose imperative, right? It means that people will always root for the failure of the opposition. So even if even if you're just making this overture of like supporting the other team, oh, it's just a game, in reality, there is this massive competitive nature to sport. And it extends to the point where spectators will often berate and ridicule their own players and coaches for making small mistakes that might lead to a team not winning. But we also think that at best, we see this really performative show of like maybe opposing players will shake hands or something. But in reality, there are lucrative corporations backstage exploiting national rivalries for profit, right? Because we see this rivalry between New Zealand and Australia actually being using to fuel people buying into sports, buying more tickets, and pretty much has hostility ground deep within it that has been commercialized into a profit-driven industry. We see that companies sell alcohol en masse in these sports games to conflicting groups that literally deepens the conflict between these people and can result in harassment and arguments between people from different countries, people from different areas. We think this is massively divisive, and as their side of the house, they do have to defend the reality of the fact that sport is so prominent, it has become a sector of the economy, right? It has become commercialized, it has become commodified, it is a massive profit-driven industry. They have to defend that industry because this is what the prominence of sport in New Zealand means. When it's tied so closely to national identity, when it's such a big sector of the economy, of course it will be commercialized, of course corporations and companies will take advantage of it. This is something they have to completely defend on their side of the house. Moving on to my splits on how New Zealand sports holds a colonial legacy. We see that rather than celebrating Māori tradition, the history of sport in Aotearoa New Zealand is one of colonization. When Indigenous history is acknowledged, it's whitewashed and distorted to grab media attention on the international market. We see the prominence of sport in New Zealand stems from an obsession only with sports that New Zealand can be successful at, something they conceded, causing original Māori sports to be marginalized. 3 mechanisms for you today. Firstly, the competitive win-lose binary integral to New Zealand sports is fertile ground for the values of conquest and dominance, meaning New Zealand has been monopolized by sports that are remnants of the British imperial rule and enforced settler colonial culture. Isaac gave you heaps of examples as to exactly what those sports are, right? All sports remnant from British rule. Secondly, because of the central aspects of conflict and competition and the commercialization of sport, we see original Māori sports like kiorahi are being tossed aside and forgotten, while millions of dollars flow into colonially supplanted sports like rugby, cricket, soccer, etc. Third and final mechanism, the profit-driven nature of sport, due to its prominence, which they have to defend, means it appropriates Māori tradition and culture to gain as much media attention as possible among foreign consumers. We saw this with the All Blacks taking possession of traditional haka without permission from iwi, and the local iwi actually had to have a campaign to force them to stop appropriating it and using it disrespectfully as they were. We stand against this on our side of the house. We stand for more inclusive modes of organization within our country, and we oppose this toxic hellscape that they're trying to promote on their side of the house. Thank you very much.
I thank the speaker for their speech and would like to invite up the second speaker of the negating team.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Fundamental problem with the arguments that affirming has given us is that they haven't been comparative in the way that they compare sports as something that's prominent with the national identity to other options. And the only other options note that they gave you was like supporting women's rights to vote. We tell you that that's too flimsy in this debate, and we tell you that's we won this debate because we've shown you time and time again that sports is the best and strongest way to unite a country, to get social progress, and to get all the benefits affirming wants to get. I'm going to talk about 3 things in this speech. Firstly, what should our national identity be based on? Secondly, how does sport affect our culture? And thirdly, I'm going to give you a really important split about how sports can't be politicized. So firstly then, let's talk about what our national identity should be based on. Because the only thing that they were able to tell you was that like our national identity should be based on like how we were the first country to give women the right to vote. Why is that national identity problematic? Firstly, we tell you that New Zealand just isn't as like egalitarian as they think, right? Like we've only recently just gotten rid of like the old and like somewhat outdated abortion law. But like the important thing to note here is that a lot of people were against removing that abortion law, right? So we still have a substantial portion within our population that are like broadly against the values that they think should be our national identity. So when they tell us that having this as our national identity is going to like unite the country in a way that sport cannot, they're just fundamentally wrong, right? Because these are issues that continue to be partisan, that continue to divide the country, and continue to be things that like we as a country just can't fundamentally agree upon, right? So, and the second thing that's really important to note here is that like their team can't just stand for like, oh, our national identity is supporting how women were the first to vote, because like along with that comes with all the like the undertone and the meaning of supporting that, right? So if you say that that's your national identity, you're also supporting like very progressive policies. You're also supporting like you're also encouraging like radical feminist policies. That's the type of thing that's going like they're supporting as a national identity. Why is that fundamentally problematic? Firstly, as I'm going to talk about in my split, that's something that's extremely political and extremely divisive, and something that just a lot of people can't get behind. A lot of people just don't feel like they can like align themselves with that message. But secondly, we think it's just like a huge problem when your national identity is literally based on like what the Green Party's policies are, right? Like regardless of whether or not you agree with those policies, that's a fundamentally problematic national identity to have, because it is literally just like a fundamental, something that fundamentally divides the country. That's something extremely problematic, and they need to engage with the comparative by telling us what actually should be the prominent feature of our national identity. Okay, so with that in mind, then, let's talk about sport, because we tell you that sport doesn't have any of those problems, and we tell you that sport actually benefits our culture. But first, before that, what did they talk about? Firstly, they talked about gender roles, but here's the problem, right? Firstly, we tell you that sports are diverse in nature, right? They could only talk to you about like rugby and netball, but we tell you that there's also a lot of other sports out there, right? That New Zealanders play and New Zealanders watch and New Zealanders engage with within their national identity. We tell you there's a lot of different games played by different genders. We tell you there's a male rugby team, there's a female rugby team, there's a male hockey team, there's a female hockey team, right? There's a women's, in fact, like in many of those cases, the female teams in fact perform better than males and also have like larger support within the New Zealand population, right? You just have to look at the Black Sticks. That's an example of a female team that is like significantly more prominent than the male team. But like besides that, we tell you that sports teams also speak out against these gender roles, and they use their platform to speak out against the gender roles that may exist within our society. That's something that they're never going to get, because they never have people that have this platform. They never have this activity that is shared within the population that everyone gets behind and everyone supports, right? That's an important thing that they need to talk about in their speech. But secondly, we tell you that all the sexism material is correlation and not causation, right? We tell you that sexism in society causes sexism within sports, right? Not the other way around. But the important distinction to make here is that sports creates the opportunity for us to confront the sexism that exists within our society, right? Because we use sport as a platform to have celebrities, to have prominent sports captains, to have prominent like team members to speak out against the sexism that exists within our society. They're never going to get that benefit, and they're never going to be able to solve that problem. Second thing to talk about here is racism and traditionalism, because they told you about like how sport reinforces like colonial ideas. That's just fundamentally problematic, right? Because we tell you that sport, as Isaac told you, sport is something that has actually fundamentally dissolved many of the racial problems that we have within New Zealand, right? Like we tell you that when like back in the 1900s, when white colonial Pakeha saw Māori and Pacifica like rugby players training together with their white counterparts and passing the ball between each other and seeing them work together as a team, that's something that fundamentally changes the way that white people see like minorities and the disenfranchised people. That's something that actually fundamentally makes New Zealand a more progressive society, because we're more accepting of other cultures, we're more accepting of minorities. They haven't engaged with that material, and it still stands in this debate. But secondly, we tell you that like sport is a great way for New Zealand to express its diversity, because sports isn't fundamentally constricted like based on culture or ideology in the same way that like feminist policy might be. So like That means that we're able to use sport to like showcase New Zealand's diversity. It looks like performing the haka before sports games. It looks like using traditional ideas within our sports teams and talking about these sorts of minority issues, right? They're never going to be able to do that because not everyone can rally behind like feminist policies in the same way that everyone is able to rally behind a sports team. Finally here, they talked about how like it creates this win-lose dichotomy and how that's bad. First thing to say here is that sports, sure, right? Like some sports supporters might be like violent or extremely supportive of their sports team, but we tell you that in many cases, it's actually a good thing because when people support their sports teams and feel patriotic for the team that they're supporting, it means that they feel a sense of pride that exists within that country. It means that they feel like proud to be a New Zealander, proud to be supporting that team. And this unity is something that's extremely important within that debate. Like, we don't think that the comparative here is like being a good person and a good feminist and like binge drinking and being violent. That's not the comparative. Okay, now I want to talk to you about why sports can't be politicized and why that's so important in this debate. Let's be comparative at this point. They can talk about four things replacing sport, right? They can talk about arts and culture, values like democracy and religion, history, the history of the country. But we tell you the important thing to note here is that all of those things can be politicized and are used as divisive political capital. Firstly, we tell you that arts and culture literally excludes everyone not within that culture, right? Like Maori culture, the Treaty of Waitangi, Te Reo Maori are all highly politicized, highly divisive in this country. Secondly, we tell you that like values like democracy and liberty literally are things that divide countries by being political, like to the point where the politicians are able to use their like national identity to like block policy they don't like. That's equally the same for like religion, where politicians use religion to block things that they don't like, and they use its status as national identity to block these policies. Thirdly, we tell you that history, our history is also extremely political and extremely problematic, right? We don't even need to go into the fact how like if the New Zealand like land wars were also part of our national identity, how problematic that would be as part of our national identity. And so the last thing to note here is that sport cannot be criticized in this way. Sports is not political in the same way, right? The most political thing that probably happened within sport was like the haka being performed before the All Blacks, but even that was a positive change for society. That's something that was good for New Zealand. So at the end of the day, we tell you that national identity shouldn't be based on something that's divisive and used by politicians as political capital to exclude communities, but rather it's about having a base level shared unity that everyone can get behind, that everyone can rally behind, extremely proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for their speech and would like to invite up the third speaker of the affirmative team.
Today, when the negating team came out here and said that it is much more important that New Zealand be well known for a sports team than things like being world leading and up-to-date issues and then globally, we believe is completely outrageous. Today, the negating team have tried to build their case around the idea that sport unifies all New Zealanders, regardless of social status and ethnicity. So here, today I'm going to be talking to you why this is not the case. So three main questions that have arisen throughout this debate today. So the first is whether or not sports teams is a positive tool to unite New Zealanders. The second being, what should our national identity be based on? And finally, who gets better cultural values? So moving on to our first point of clash about whether or not sport is a positive tool that unites New Zealanders. So we heard a lot at first and second today from the negating team that sports unifies all people. So they told us no one, anyone can join regardless of race, gender, ethnicity, and therefore it can be really uniting. They also told us that when we see minority groups succeeding in sports teams internationally, it helps break these cultural stereotypes. However, then I ask you, is the only reason that these cultural stereotypes can be broken by having these minorities prove themselves in international status? And, you know, it sets the premise that these minorities actually only ever seen as equal when they work twice as hard, when they put in twice as much effort to get into these teams and succeed, which we don't think is a positive thing to work on. The second thing that we brought up this issue at first, and we told you how sports actually creates and enforces many traditional gender stereotypes. And a second, gender stereotypes, and how this is negative. Yes, I'll take that.
The performance of rugby players like BG Williams, like Jonah Lomu, was crucial in changing perceptions of Māori and Pacific Islanders in New Zealanders. New Zealand, would you take that away?
No, like we wouldn't. Okay, what we say is that of course we wouldn't take away their success as an individual and a person. But what we don't agree with is that our country, breaking these stereotypes about diversity, being pinpoint on that person's sporting success. So going on to that point about gender stereotypes. So we told you that, it creates stereotypes. And what we got from the negating team today was that we have girls teams and we have boys teams. They're both just as equally in the media. They're both just there. However, while that is true, that is not the deep point that we tried to get across. What we tried to get across is that these female teams are in dresses, they're in skirts, they're taller, they're leaner. They have to be, that's that stereotypical look of a netballer or like a hockey player, etc. And then on the alternative, we see these male sports teams that are bulkier, that are buff, that are strong, that if they're slow, then they won't be able to catch the ball and hit the person down. If they're not strong enough, then they won't be effective. So we think that this reinforces, these traditional and negative gender stereotypes that we don't support. And that is why we see that sport isn't a positive way to unite New Zealanders. We also think that it is unrealistic for the negating team today to come out here and say that every single person likes sport and that everyone can rally around sport, because that is strictly not true. I mean, today in a culture where we have so many different hobbies, we have art, we have music, we have things like that. We don't believe that it is true to say that the entire country can rally around a sports team, because to be honest, not many people care that much about sports teams if they haven't played it themselves, or if they don't have some sort of family tradition around it, etc. Whereas things like when we had the forefront of uniting things like, what we propose as the alternative to Unite New Zealand is things like women's rights and culture and etc., which I'll touch a little bit more on the second point of clash. But that is why we believe that we have won. That is why we have believed that we have won, this point on whether or not sports is a positive tool to unite New Zealanders, because we don't think it's realistic to say that all New Zealanders unite around sports or that's where they align. And also we've pointed out many issues that can arise with the sports. So going on to the second point of clash today about what should our national identity be based on. Yes?
We told you that sport is so unique because people can connect with it regardless of their race, socioeconomic status, or gender. Do you have a response to this?
I think while that is true, as a whole nation, that shouldn't be our forefront and our focus point. For example, in Sweden, it's known for equality and its democracy and its good values. That is something that we want to stand for. We're not trying to take away the fact that people can find themselves in sports, etc., and they do get better values. What better values like toughing it out and having a can-do attitude and resilience. But what we want to stand for is people having attributes like self-worth and identity and feeling, that they're actually represented in community. So onto that second point of clash. So we heard a lot at second and stuff like that about how people cannot and don't always align with things that they, like women's rights, etc. But that's not all we're wanting to use or has a forefront or focal point of New Zealand's identity. When we say what we want New Zealand's identity to be, it's more things like culture or being culturally diverse. For example, New Zealand is unique in the fact that we are actually one of the only countries that didn't completely annihilate the native culture that was here when the colonizers arrived. Like, we want people to know New Zealand for that purpose, to know us because we were the country that united with both cultures and can live equally. We want to be known by having, Jacinda Ardern, a female prime minister, doing really well. And, we're seeing today that by her being, this female thing, it's allowing people, and especially females, to think a little bit more and rethink women's places and where they deserve to be, and that in workplaces, etc. No, and we believe that this is positive. This is what we want to focus on. Now, we also heard that sports doesn't have this problems, but like I said before, I don't think it is fair or realistic to say that everyone is into sports, and therefore you're not getting this entire nation unity like they're saying. However, when we're talking about rights, when we're talking about culture, and when we're talking about, these are things that actually affect people like every day, and in some point in their life it's going to have a big impact on them. So we think it's far more important that they relate to something like that, or be proud to be a part of a country that is like forward moving in these big, controversial topics, rather than a sports team. So we also heard at second about how sports can't be like politicized and things like that, etc. And while we agree that they can't, we also believe that sports have become, because they've become so popular, they've actually become like economized. So like people are sponsorship and things like that has become a massive aspect in the economical sector. And we also think it's negative because this draws in people like Nike sponsors. So like the rugby team is going around with a Nike tick on it, and then when you look at Nike and their workspace environments and how they run sweatshops, etc., we don't want to be aligned with this, and this is why we think it is negative. And that is why, as the affirmative team today, we're very, very proud to affirm. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for their speech and invite up the third speaker of the negative team.
It seems pretty clear to us in this debate that the affirming team lacks a comprehensive understanding of how social progress, especially long-term sustainable social progress, is actually achieved. Because we refute that social progress is achieved just from being proud of past progress, and we don't think that actually allows people to get the kind of wide-scale buy-in and wide-scale public support for future growth. We think that the only way that you get future social progress that you can be proud of in the future and can be proud of in the long run is to support things like having sports be part of our national identity, because it promotes good behavior and breaks social stereotypes. 3 points of clash for the House today then. Firstly, how does this affect social progress? Secondly, which side gets more community unity and inclusivity? And lastly, how does this affect the behavior of individuals? On this first idea of social progress then, the affirming team told us that the New Zealand's culture surrounding sport entrenches gender roles like toxic masculinity and females. They told us they would prefer that we celebrate like social progress like the women's suffrage movement. Firstly, we tell you that we haven't heard a clear characterization or conceptualization of what their world looks like. What exactly do they think getting behind the suffrage movement actually looks like? Because we think it's very difficult for them to say that, hey, just because you get behind the suffrage movement is going to create like a more progress for women in the future, if they can't give us a clear characterization of the mechanisms that allow that to carry out. The second response here then is to tell you that, as I flagged in my introduction, we think that social progress is only achieved when the prevailing narratives in society that entrench those roles are undermined. We think that having your national pride be predicated on giving women the right to vote 100 years ago, or even if it was like having your national pride predicated on something that happened more recently, means that you're necessarily relying on a past success, means that you're like relying on that thing that you did in the past to carry you on to the future. We don't think that provides a mechanism for furthering social progress by actually changing stereotypes that still exist. Because if AF thinks that we should just be proud of the social progress we've achieved, then they necessarily think that we should be proud of where we currently are, and they don't accept the kinds of challenges that are still being faced by Māori people on a daily basis, the gender pay gap that still exists for females on a daily basis. We think that if they accept these things exist, they need to provide us a mechanism for how they get more change in the future that isn't just being proud of the past. So how do we get that kind of wide-scale social change then? We tell you that because that social progress only occurred when there's wide-scale buy-in, sports is uniquely placed to be able to deliver this in a public sphere. And we tell you that firstly, this looks like the All Blacks talking about mental health. So it shows that they can both be masculine on the sports field, but when they're off of it, they can still open up about mental health, and they can have those two areas of their identity not be conflicting with each other. This looks like females breaking stereotypes, and we don't accept that they just tell us that because the Silver Ferns are like the only team that's known, or because they have to wear skirts, that we're entrenching female stereotypes. Because we tell you that sports may not be perfect as it currently is, but we think that sports has space for progress. We think that the kind of progress that has been, occurring in sports already allows their scope for women to stop wearing skirts on the netball court if they wish, and have those stereotypes be broken down. We think this looks like the Black Ferns, who do incredibly well, and that's demonstrated by the fact that AF knows of their success and knows who they are, and most of us do, that those female sports teams who are performing on the world stage in rugby, which might be seen as a male-dominated sport, show that females can hold their own on those sporting fields and there is space for improvement. On the idea of racial equality, then they give us this split about colonialism, but we tell you that it's more important that those minorities are just seen as equal, even if they have been oppressed. So we think that sport gives them the opportunity to be seen as equals. We think that it's not a huge deal if that looks like they're excelling in rugby over a different sport, because it means that they're seen as equal, they're seen as valuable, and they're seen as people who are worthy. I'll take a POI.
At first, we were told that sports and sports players only embrace past controversial topics or topics of social progress when it is already popular and mainstream. If this is true, as your first speaker said, how is it possible that sport can actually produce social change?
I do not think that our first speaker said that. I think it's very clear that what we've been saying down the line and has been consistent is that sports people are for example, females can be held up as sports role models and can be put on a pedestal. And those are people who do create social change, who do look like, I'm sure Isaac mentioned the All Blacks and the fact that they've been champions of mental health, which is something that is still relatively controversial within society, and they're leading some of the progress that's been happening on that. Don't accept that POI. Secondly, then, let's move on to the idea of community, unity, and inclusivity. AF told us that since sports is competitive, it's necessarily divisive, which contributes to a bad environment. We tell you that sports is not inherently violent. Even rugby has rules in place that means that it stays within a safe ground. But rather than that, we tell you that there's a huge emphasis on being good sports people. This means even after all the energy that you leave out on the rugby field or out on a boxing field, you come off as soon as you step off that field, you get along with the other team, you show gratitude, you show respect, and you're gracious in victory and humble in defeat. We think those are the kinds of things that promote community unity. We don't think that anyone just takes the violence they see on the sports field and thinks that, hey, I'm going to implement that in my everyday life. We don't think that's something people do. We also tell you that even if supporters don't engage with the same regional team, those people still engage with each other in a kind of bantery way about the regional competitions. But additionally to that, when you even if you're a Blue supporter and someone else is a Highlanders supporter, at the point at which you get behind that national team, when the national team plays their test matches, you're united in your commonalities. You find common ground despite your differences in the regional teams that you support, and you're able to unite with that community and feel part of something that's bigger than yourself.
On that
Let's
point,
move on then to the idea that they think social progress or culture can unite us. We tell you that social progress and culture are not the same as sports for three main reasons. We tell you that not everyone can connect. So Kunle explained this perfectly when he told you that the necessarily political nature of social progress, which means that most of those policies would look like green lefty policies, means that you're not engaging the entirety of the country. And it's not always true that, we don't accept the claim that if New Zealand had like adopted pride in their social progress earlier, that everyone would suddenly be homogenous in their belief for that social progress. We think there's always going to be differences that occur. Secondly, then, this means that this leads to public outrage and a certain amount of argument that occurs. And we think that the point at which you get arguments between people about something that you have deemed to be the core like pillar of your national identity, that's when you have a breakdown of national identity. How does sport deliver the things that those things don't? Then as we told you at Isaac, it is accessible to everyone. This means you don't need to have a family tradition of watching sport to be able to turn on the television, watch the free sport on channel 1 and be able to engage with that. We told you that gives you common ground and it also gives you national pride. And we tell you this national pride and this like national sense of achievement is something that puts us on the world stage and then allows people like Jacinda Ardern to actually shine and to showcase everything else that we have going for us. We don't think being proud of sport necessarily means that you block out everything else, because when you get that media attention, when you get that coverage, you get things like Jacinda Ardern being covered as well. Lastly, on behavior, then they told us that behavior becomes worse because it promotes a drinking culture. We heard no response to Isaac's extensive mechanism at first around how behavior is promoted in individuals. This looks like behaviors around resilience, around teamwork, around perseverance, about being gracious and respectful to your coaches, to your teammates, to your referees, and to your other team. We think that the participation that occurs in sport and the amount of role modeling that occurs, that when you look at a sports team and want to emulate them, you get positive behavior in individuals. You get a society that is functional, and you get a society that can actually achieve the social progress that the affirming team wants to talk so much about. Proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for his speech. As is traditional, now reverse the speaking order, so I'd like to invite up the negative reply speaker.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Perfect. The fundamental failing of side affirmative in today's debate was that they failed to provide us a concrete idea of what this world looks like. Because whilst we told you what it actually looks like on the ground for New Zealanders to unify behind sport at the rugby club, at the water cooler, at Eden Park, what they failed to do was tell us what it actually looks like to unite behind women's suffrage 100 years after we gave women the vote. What it actually looks like to unite behind culture, something which only those of educated status and those potentially from minority groups can directly engage with. We gave you a concrete world, and that is why we've won today's debate. 2 points for the House. Firstly, whether sport as a prominent part of NZ's national identity unifies society, and secondly, whether this national identity promotes positive individual behaviour. Let's take a look at this first point on the unity that our national identity achieves. We told you right down the line that because sport is accessible to all New Zealanders, as it has low financial barriers to entry, it's easier to join a club and follow a team, and it's an apolitical aspect of society that doesn't directly isolate groups because of their political leanings. It's something that all New Zealanders can rally behind and connect with other New Zealanders in. What did they give us? They gave us a comparative world in which they use culture and social progress as an identity that New Zealanders can unify behind. 3 responses to this. Firstly, as I addressed in my introduction, they haven't actually told us what it looks like to engage behind this form of national identity. Does it look like engaging behind like some billboard that you see of like, we gave women the vote 150 years ago in like a public place? They haven't given us any clear idea of what this world looks like.
Secondly, we tell you that this identity doesn't include everyone, because as we've told you, things like culture and being proud of social progress are necessarily often exclusive to people who come from more educated families and who are wealthier New Zealanders, because they have the time to go to that play, to go and see that Māori artwork. We think that it's not something that's accessible to all New Zealanders, but also it doesn't include people from the majority, because what does it look like celebrating white culture when it's founded on colonialism? They haven't given us a clear idea of what their world looks like. Finally, our final response is that this identity directly incites outrage, because when we champion things like gay marriage, something that was really valuable in New Zealand, but if we put that on our national identity, you so isolate this huge group of New Zealanders who don't support that. Why is it so important that national identity unifies people? Firstly, because everyone is able to enjoy the sense of belonging that you get from this national identity. But secondly, and so importantly in today's debate, the national identity is only seen as legitimate when everybody buys into it. Because otherwise you get these fractious identities that no one unifies behind. You lose all the power of a national identity. Second point then, whether this national identity promotes positive individual behaviour. They had two claims for this. Firstly, that sport endorses conflict because it's competitive. Firstly, let's just have a sense check on this. We don't think that people are out killing each other in the streets because the Blues beat the Hurricanes last weekend. But secondly, we tell you that it actually unifies a lot of groups, because when you are in a competitive space, you unify behind those people who you're playing with or behind those people in your region. We think that that's incredibly beneficial for New Zealanders. Then they told us that sport promotes negative stereotypes around women and minorities. We gave you two responses to this. Firstly, we told you that generally this is just not promoted in 2020. We have really beneficial sporting role models that talk about things like mental health. But secondly, we tell you that even if it is promoted in the rare occasion, people are called out for that. That's why that rugby players get such a berating in the press after they party or do something wrong. We tell you 9 times out of 10, what sports players are doing is promoting positive values. The Kieran Reads of the world, the Kane Williamsons, the Lisa Carringtons. That is resilience, that is teamwork, that is effort and self-sacrifice. That is what we want to side with and promote in young New Zealanders today. So proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for his speech and invite up the final speaker in today's debate.
Right here. As the affirming team today, we do not have to give an entirely new model of a world. What we're proving today is that we should regret the massive prominence that sport currently has, and we have done that effectively through 3 points. Firstly, does it actually unify New Zealand? Secondly, who gets better social progress? And thirdly, who promotes better values? Firstly, onto the first point about whether or not it actually unifies New Zealand. What we saw brought forward from the negating team was this idea about how sports is something that includes every person in New Zealand, regardless of their social status or their ethnicity. It promotes people getting together and a really good sportsmanship. But we think we won this point when we brought to you how it poorly represents so many different minorities within New Zealand, and about the behaviour of individuals that sports promotes. When sports is based on, when you're meeting people of different teams and their relationship is based on wanting them to lose, we think that this is not unity, and this is not something that we should have New Zealand attached to their identity. Because New Zealand already has a national identity, a separate national identity of sport. We're not saying that we should get rid of sports. We just think that we should reduce the sports element of our identity, and that we should really push forward these values. For example, when we gave the example of Sweden, how when people think of Sweden, they think of equality, they think of democracy. And we think this is what New Zealand and the example that New Zealand should strive towards, because we think that this narrative is a lot more inclusive of all people within New Zealand. And then onto our, so in that first point, and I think also on this point, when we gave examples about, for example, how it poorly represents Māori culture, like when the haka was used as used for entertainment and as whitewashed rather than actually displaying our culture. Like for example, with the previous haka that the All Blacks did, iwis had to literally protest in order to change the haka, even though like the people, like the sports teams had no idea about Māori culture. And I think that like that shows that it obviously is not like that sports obviously is not inclusive of like of culture and diversity. So on to our second point about who gets better social progress. What we saw brought forward from the negating team was that like, well, now sports gives minorities like a platform to be able to become role models of a sort in order to promote inclusivity. As the affirming team, we don't contest this. Like we think that like, yeah, this does happen, but we don't think that minorities should have to like prove to like work twice as hard and prove themselves at an international level in order to earn respect. We think that this should be something that is like just like a generally like accepted without New Zealand, and that and we think that we won this point when we like gave the example of how Jacinda Ardern's presence like as a Prime Minister is positively affecting like women's role models within New Zealand, and how like she became well known internationally because she embraced inclusivity and tolerance, not because of like sports and things. So on to our third point about who promotes better values, what we saw brought forward from the negating team was this idea about like sportsmanship and how like people like professional things like that. So we brought forward as the affirming team that like relationships like are based on them wanting to lose. Like this is not good sportsmanship and these aren't good values to have. And secondly, when they said that like their binge drinking culture and stuff like that was like mischaracterized because like people, they're professionals and don't leave it on the field. We think this was completely wrong because spectators and the main issue is the spectators. Spectators are not held to the same standard as professional sports players. They're the ones who are promoting the binging culture within the games and selling alcohol. So therefore, we are proud to affirm this.
I thank the speaker for their speech, and I thank everybody for the great debate.